Well, as today's gospel begins, John starts off by calling everyone a brood of snakes, the offspring of snakes, one generation passing their nature and actions onto the next. Certainly not politically correct language. You would think the lectionary could help us out on this Gaudete Sunday. As we close in on Christmas, you would think the lectionary would be more bright, joyous, from this gospel, but instead we get a pushback from John. So, perhaps we should just focus on the epistle. It's much nicer. Paul's words seem so much easier for us, at least initially. He wants us to be happy. He wants us to enjoy the world with an unshakable confidence in the inherent goodness of life. Paul says that we can find real happiness by being open-minded of every person, not worrying about every little thing or sweating the small stuff, praying for what we need, not what we want, and being open to life in the present. What's not to like about Paul's words today on this Rejoice Sunday? But I'm always interested in the backstory to these very bright and hope-filled words. Well, in fact, he writes this from prison. He's getting ready to go to trial. It may mean his death. So in the midst of that, this depressing and despair, Paul says, rejoice. In the midst of his circumstances, when the norm of us would be more of emotional tightening, building and defending our walls, collecting our sticks and stones to be in the red, on his transformation in faith and pushes back on the negativity that would be toxic and expresses gentleness and peace. So if we're looking for that kind of joy, the joy that Paul has in the midst of circumstances and chaos and problems, if we're looking for that kind of peace, perhaps we should go back and look at the gospel today and look through that lens for us. Because just past the pushback and the admonition, John illustrates some actions that can begin a transformation in who we can become. John reminds us repentance has less to do with how fervently one prays or how faithfully one attends worship services, and has everything to do with generosity and unselfishness. These tangible outward expressions that demonstrate and encourage this inward transformation. It's interesting to me that when each of the people ask John, he has a collective, what should we do? And John says, we'll do this. And then it says, well, there were some tax collectors, and they said, well, what are we supposed to do? Then there were some soldiers, and they came up and said, well, what are we supposed to do? That they had fallen into, I believe what that tells us, is that their life expression had become rote and patternized to the point that they didn't recognize even the simplest things that could transform their life. They just kind of moved in the pattern of life, and one habit became another, and one expectation became the next, and one material object became the next one, and they never realized that the simplest things can transform your life and change you and give you the joy that Paul is speaking of today as he says, rejoice. So we need to look at ourselves and say, what is it that we do on autopilot as our first response? And is that the response that's filled with gentleness and peace? From the moment that we are marked as Christ's own forever at the sacrament of baptism, we are all to be ministers. Reflections of Christ expressed and extended through each of you. When we are marked as Christ's own forever in this sacrament of baptism, there isn't a retirement plan offered, or perhaps some other time. It's about what will you do in your moments that you have each and every day. The joy of Christ in you. John is far more concerned today with what comes after baptism than baptism itself. John gives us practical ways to begin living lives as the hands and heart and face of Jesus. And Paul reminds us what transformation responds like in the tension of the chaos of our circumstances. And so the question, what should we do today in this time of Advent? Perhaps our question is, how can Jesus be born not just for us, but how can Jesus be born in us? How can Jesus live through us? Well, you're the hands of Jesus. When your first response is, what can I do to help? Not, I don't have the time or the resources to help, or shouldn't someone at the church be doing something about this? You're the hands of Jesus when you decide to be present and deeply grounded in the moment in your faith. That's what the tax collectors and that's what the soldiers were asking. John, help us to see how we can be deeply grounded and present in every moment of our lives. You're the face of Jesus when you're able to smile with gentleness and peace when someone cuts you off on El Camino Real or 85. Or when someone delivers a snarky comment to you. You have the heart of Jesus when you share what you have, not what you wish you had. You are Jesus' hands and face and heart. When you turn around in those moments of your life every day, and you look to see and acknowledge that Jesus is actually standing there with you all along.